Okay, let's get started then.
Go for it.
Chapter 10, do we understand yet? And if we get through all that part, I'll try to do our discipleship journey, which is the last of this section in the book. So this is the Revised English Bible version, and we're studying, this is the first 12 verses of Mark, 8th chapter. There was another occasion about this time when a huge crowd had collected and they had no food. Jesus called his disciples and said to them, "My heart goes out to these people. They have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will faint on the way, and some of them have a long way to go." His disciples answered, "How can anyone provide these people with bread in this remote place?" "How many loaves have you?" he asked, and they answered, 7. So I found this picture of a little different than what you see typically, but so this is feeding. So he ordered people to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks to God, he broke the bread and gave the disciples to distribute, and they distributed it to the people. They also had a few fish which he blessed and ordered them to distribute. They ate and were satisfied, and 7 baskets were filled with what was left over. The people numbered about 4,000. Then he dismissed them and at once got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. Then the Pharisees came out and began to argue with him. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this ask for a sign?" So my first thought was, these people were with Jesus for 3 days. Can you imagine being with Jesus for 3 days? What would a little mini reunion with Jesus, what would that be like?
Fantastic.
So what do you think Jesus was doing for those 3 days?
I would say he's ministering and healing and teaching.
Sharing a few jokes?
Maybe.
I would hope.
Yeah.
I always have the vision that it's like a reunion. And so he's preaching and teaching part of the time, and part of the time the kids are playing in the background, and the adults are talking and conversing, and every once in a while he stands up and shares a message.
Did they have volleyball back then?
Sure, they had the Olympics.
Well,
Soccer.
Olympics,
When did the Olympics start?
in Greece.
No, I was going to say, I know it was in Greece, but I don't remember.
I don't think the Olympics was going on because they did that in the nude.
That's true. That we know of.
So this is a little quiz. What is our clue that this incident took place in Gentile territory?
Is that town?
Okay, I'll give you another clue. The arrow, I found this picture. The arrow doesn't point to Dalmanutha, but it's right above it. Dalmanutha. Okay, so there's another clue. So he was going to Dalmanutha. So where was he coming from then? No.
Oh,
Well, assuming he crossed the Sea of Galilee,
oh, that's right. That's
you would
right.
assume he's over there on the right side, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not for certain. I mean, he could have started for somewhere else, but assuming he crossed the sea, because it talks about through the first 8 chapters, he's crossed from one side back to the other, back to the other. He's crossing back and forth.
I think when the last storm hit, they were headed to Bethsaida, the town that I remember.
Okay, up there in the upper right.
Yeah. And, you know, these maps are a little bit deceptive because most of these little towns are walking distance. It looks far on the map, but most of them are about 6 miles apart, 5 to 6 miles. So
Yeah, I think the Sea of Galilee
Why
is
is he taking a boat when he can walk?
Exactly.
Well, wouldn't you
Hey,
take
you
a
have to
boat and you
cross.
could cross 6 miles across rather than walk all the way around? I would.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially walking. Yeah, they
These
didn't have
guys are
cars.
fishermen. They had a boat.
Day, you might want to walk.
Yeah. I think Sea of Galilee is about 13 miles in length, and I don't know it's 6 miles wide or something
Yeah,
like
I'd say
that.
it's about a 2-to-1 ratio.
Okay, so he got into a boat, went to Dalmanutha, which is on the west side, the Jewish side. So crossed the Galilee, which I'm assuming he did. And if Paul is correct, he was up in Bethsaida before. He left from the east side, which is the Gentile side. That's where we come from. So last week we were talking about the Syro-Phoenician woman and the dogs.
Yes, yes.
So he had this exchange, and he called Gentiles dogs, and they were asking whether, should the dogs be allowed to eat the children's bread. But now he feeds 4,000 Gentiles, 4,000 dogs, and there are 7 baskets of leftovers or scraps, which is what they were talking about before. And she said, well, even the dogs under the table eat the scraps, so what do you make of this latest action of him feeding? So they shouldn't have it. Well, I guess he changed his mind.
Yeah. He learned his lesson.
So now he feeds 4,000.
Well, if he's on the Jewish side and they can feed everybody there and they have plenty of scraps left over, that may say something about what's available for the Gentiles.
Okay. Well, he fed the Jews. I think there was 5,000 on that side, from the Jewish side.
There was 5,000 men. They didn't say when.
Yeah. Well, 5,000. So he goes to the other side and likewise feeds them. So, and this is the second time the Gentiles have been asked to provide bread to people. Both times they thought Jesus wanted them to go out somewhere to buy it. They were saying, well, this remote place, where am I going to get any bread? So, besides, and the first time they said, well, that'd take over, the first time they said they'd take over 200 denarii. Well, they didn't have it. So what do you think, having witnessed the feeding of the 5,000, did they learn anything when he asked them to feed the 4,000?
Evidently not.
So,
Either that or they had dementia.
He is a little frustrated with that.
Short-term memory loss.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what do you?
I never knew growing up that there were 2 stories. It's interesting to me because everybody heard the story of Jesus feeding the thousands, but I never knew it was one group was Jewish and one group was Gentile.
Yeah.
It really does make a difference in your studies when you learn it.
Okay, so he fed 5,000 men, or on the Jewish side, 4,000 men, or however, it didn't really say, but on the Gentile side, what's that? Does that say anything to us about the kingdom of heaven? Okay, so how?
All right, look.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
At least Mark is making a point, that Jesus really did want to minister to both the Jews and the Gentiles. And we know that was a big debate at that time.
Is that part of the emphasis of he crosses from one side, then he goes back, and he crosses back? It makes about 4 trips across the Sea of Galilee. Is that what we're? So this is Jesus has just reenacted for the second time the great sign story of Exodus, manna in the wilderness. But the Pharisees, trying to test him, ask for a sign from heaven, and he refuses, saying, no sign shall be given to this generation. So haven't they just seen a sign? So is there a distinction between they say a sign from heaven and what they've just seen? What kind of sign did the Pharisees want to see then? If they is there
know.
Are they expecting
Stars?
something different from what they saw?
Yes. I would say, yeah, they're probably looking for something more fantastic.
Something. So what would a sign from heaven be?
I don't know. Stars falling from the skies, new stars appearing. I'm not sure.
Okay.
They're probably looking for somebody to release them from Roman rule. They probably like to see a revolution.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So what clue does Jesus' refusal give us about how to read this story? I can't have the answer there. But they say, the authors say that the lesson here is that the true indicators of God's sovereignty are not heavenly but earthly. What do they mean by that? Do you agree with them?
Maybe because Jesus is reaching out to the disenfranchised, and including them as precious as the bigwigs who like to flaunt their.
Okay. Well, maybe it's just as simple as he's providing food. I mean, it's a physical thing that people need. That there will be food on the table for everyone.
Well, I think a statement like that is also very characteristic of what the Jewish expectation was. They were looking for God's heaven on earth. They were looking for God's reign and not having to live under any other king other than God. I don't remember if I read it in this textbook or somewhere else recently. Maybe it was part of our scripture introduction to scripture class that we've been doing. But even though the Pharisees believed in life after death, it said that most Jews of this time in Palestine did not believe in life after death. They were looking for an earthly salvation.
Okay.
Well, I've always interpreted manna as feeding me spiritual, not a physical hunger.
Really?
Yeah.
I've had the exact opposite because when they were out in the wilderness, what did they get? They got food to eat because they were hungry each day.
Yeah, I just thought it was symbolic,
Well,
not imagining real bread falling from heaven.
well, I think if Dorothy was here, she'd say there was something when they went out there in the wilderness. There was some kind of a that they could gather. I can't
I
remember
thought
what
they were
plant.
some kind of locust.
It's some kind of a rosin from certain plants.
A certain
that
plant,
produce
yeah.
edible sugar. And that's the kind of scientific speculation about what manna might have been.
But from the spiritual standpoint, I think you're falling back to the Gospel of John, where Jesus is on the bread and all that. But right here, it's food because they were hungry, and in the wilderness they were hungry. But anyway, so there's different ways to look at bread. What I found interesting is Mark and the other Gospels look at talk about signs differently. Mark's Jesus says no sign will be given, while Matthew and Luke's Jesus says the only sign that will be given is the sign of Jonah. And then you've got John who says, well, in his gospel, he's real big on signs, and he has 7 signs to show Jesus is Messiah. But Mark says, well, signs are only for unbelievers, only sought by unbelievers. So why do three of them have such a different take from Mark, who wrote the first gospel?
Yeah. You see the temple leaders, the Sanhedrin, very jealous of Jesus. They didn't want their power to be taken away. And they had already plotted to find ways to get rid of and to have Jesus arrested and done away with. So that was already in the plan to get rid of him. They were jealous.
What's
They
that
were
gonna,
afraid that the people If they started following Jesus, they would lose their power as leaders in the temple. And
Okay, that
so-
wasn't my question though.
but
My
the way it
question is,
worked
why are
out
the
is
gospel writers?
Jesus needed to die on the cross for our sins anyway, and it was all planned out by the Trinity that Jesus had to die on the cross for our sins.
Well, that's not the
However-
question though.
Huh?
That's not the question. Read the question on the screen.
I don't know, let somebody else answer it.
I mean,
I think that might be the reason in Mark. I think Jim's version could be what Mark was talking about, that Mark was recognizing that the Sanhedrin and the hypocrites were the unbelievers. But I don't understand why the others are saying the sign of Jonah. Jonah actually, well, he refused to follow Jesus, so maybe that's similar to what Mark is saying. But John, of course, is always different.
I think that Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days was symbolic of the death and resurrection. So that's the sign symbolically Jesus was talking
Oh,
about.
that was what they were talking. That's what he was talking about. Not who Jonah was.
No, I think he's speaking metaphorically that, I mean, Jonah, for all intents and purposes, is dead. If you've been swallowed by a large fish, you're not going to get out.
But Jonah needed a sign. I mean,
Yeah.
he was refusing because
Yeah,
he said,
well,
"I'm
so
not going to do it."
Yeah,
So-
that was the sign to Jonah. But
Right.
for this generation, I think he's kind of speaking interpretively that his death and resurrection are going to be that sign.
I always wondered what the sign of Jonah was, because it was like, okay,
Really, we
he
don't
got
know.
swallowed, spit out, and saved the cities that he went to,
Yeah.
Nineveh.
he didn't want to say. But still, why do they look at signs so differently?
Yeah.
Why did one of them say no sign, and the other three say, oh, let's have different versions? One says, here's 7 signs, and the others say only 1 sign. I don't know, I'm just kind of.
Does it have to do with, I would say maybe it has to do with the Gospels were written for different audiences. And so maybe for each audience they needed,
A different version of the story.
well, or it's what they,
Explanation, a different
Yeah.
explanation.
yeah, maybe a different explanation.
I think the book of John was reacting to the other. So
Okay.
I think John was very clear that he wanted there to be signs from heaven. So I think there was almost like a disagreement with what Mark said. I don't think the other synoptic gospels are necessarily disagreeing, but just like Carl said, they're explaining it differently.
And these gospels came from different traditions
Yeah.
and probably were remembered differently. So
Yeah.
Jesus said something about signs, and then 3 different people wrote it that didn't quite all get it the same.
Does
So
the,
why did
that
Matthew and
happens.
Luke get it the same? That's confusing.
Why did that?
Why did Matthew and Luke both say the signs of Jonah, but
Because they're
Mark didn't?
copying Mark.
I know, but Mark didn't say it.
Oh,
maybe the times
Okay.
have changed
yeah, I don't
from
know. Might have-
when
might have
Mark
been
was
the common
writing.
story. That might be Q.
Q, there you
That might
go.
be from Q.
Maybe Mark was writing at a different time. He was writing earliest.
Yeah.
By the time John wrote, they were, they were having problems in the Jewish Christians split, you know.
Yeah.
Well, it's also interesting that it's only Matthew and Mark that even list the feeding of the 4,000. John and Luke don't list that. They only list the feeding of the 5,000, which is why I think a lot of us
Oh,
assume that the 2 feedings are one.
Oh, they just got the number wrong.
No,
Well,
they
it's not just that. It's that Matthew and Mark list 2 different times. They list the 5,000 and the 4,000.
Yeah, Mark does.
Well, it does. I think Matthew does also. But
Okay.
Luke and John have condensed it into one feeding of 5,000. And I don't know if that has any significance, that feeding of the 4,000 was on the Gentile side.
Interesting.
Okay, so what would be your conclusion by them omitting the 1 are they kind of defeating what Mark was trying to accomplish by saying Jews and Gentiles?
I don't know. I can't quite put my mind in the mind of the writers. For some reason or other, they felt it was more important to emphasize a single feeding of 5,000.
Well, usually Mark. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Pardon?
Go ahead. I interrupted you.
Well, I was just going to say John tends to be, I think it's already been mentioned, he's more symbolic. He goes in for symbolism, you know. The word was in the beginning, and you know, et cetera, et cetera. Mark is more, you know, just a very brief narrative, and that might be part of it. That for John's sake, he didn't need a second feeding of 5,000. He already had the symbolism.
But okay, I'm going to ask, did he miss the symbolism though? Mark is usually spare with his words, and here he goes to some detail in describing two feedings of different 5,000 and 4,000. And you're saying John just has one. Was Mark making a point, which we were talking about, of Jews and Gentiles? And maybe by John's time, he wasn't worried about the Jews anymore because the congregation, you know, the Jewish Christians were kind of dividing. I'm just speculating.
So if Mark was written in about 70 AD, that's 15, 20 years after Paul's ministry. So the Gentiles were already a major part of the church. And we already know from our other class on the Pauline versus the Petrians that Mark was probably a Pauline. So maybe he was trying to write this in a way that would make it important to the Gentile church as well.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So who did the counting?
Russ was around.
The answer to that's easy. It was Judas. He was the one who kept the books.
Wow. There was no conflict against me.
Okay. Well, here they are crossing the Sea of Galilee. The next section in this chapter is about verses 13 to 21. With that, he left them, re-embarked, and made for the other shore. Okay, so which direction are we going now? Back east. He went to Dalmanutha on the west, so he's re-embarked and head for the other side. Now they had forgotten to take bread, or loaves in some translations, with them, and had only one loaf in the boat. He began to warn them. Beware, he said, be on your guard against the leaven of the Pharisees and the bread and the leaven of Herod. So they began to talk among themselves about having no bread. Knowing this, he said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Have you no inkling yet? Do you still not understand? Are your minds closed? You have eyes, can you not see? You have ears, can you not hear? Have you forgotten? He's got to get down on that.
I like it when Jesus is irritated.
Well, you know, you do feed 9,000 people, and then they're like, oh.
Well, and they had leftovers and they forgot to bring them. That's what I'm thinking. It's like, if I were him, I'd make them go back over and get them. Go back and get them.
I do think that's kind of an unusual little statement there, why Mark thought to include it. And Myers makes a point about it. I never really got his point real well, but he makes a point about the one loaf there.
Yeah.
See, I was thinking you could use that.
Yeah. One loaf can go.
Hook. You got fish. You're fine.
Well, he continues, when I broke the 5 loaves among the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they said. And how many did I, when I broke the 7 loaves among 4,000? 7, they answered. Okay, so he's giving them some clues, it sounds like. He says, do you still not understand?
This is that numerology thing again.
Yeah.
No, we'll get into that just a little bit.
12, remember, Ron? 12.
Well,
The mathematician knows all that.
5, 12, and 7. We'll get to that on the next slide. Some of his...
Dennis, you know, one thing that strikes me, if I were one of the disciples, and I'm following this guy, Jesus, and twice he's fed thousands of people without us having to take provisions, why would you pack a whole bunch of bread?
Okay.
You just assume he's gonna do his
It's gonna
magic.
happen again.
Yeah, exactly. That's contrary to the message that the authors are trying to say, but um, maybe they're just thinking, hey, I have this moving refrigerator. Why worry about food?
Okay. Okay. Well, part of this scripture, particularly the eyes, the mind, the eyes, the ears, heart, that's an allusion to a rebuke that Moses gave the Israelites a long time before Jesus, where Moses says, "You have seen for yourselves all that the Lord did in Egypt to Pharaoh, to all his courtiers, to his whole land, the great challenge which you yourselves witnessed, those great signs and portents. But to this day, the Lord has not given you a mind to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear." So that's kind of and when he says, have you forgotten? Is he referring back to this? Or is he referring back, have you forgotten what we did just a little while ago with the 5,000? Which I don't know, which maybe is both of them. But there's some Old Testament parallels here. And then there's another one, the prophet Elisha in 2 Kings, a man from Baal Shalisha, bringing the man of God some of the new season's bread, 20 barley loaves and fresh ripe ears of grain. Elisha said, "Give this to the people to eat." His attendant protested, "I cannot set this before 100 people." Still he insisted, "Give it to the people to eat. This is the word of the Lord. They will eat, and there will be some left over." So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left over, as the Lord had said. So another parallel with what Jesus did, an earlier prophet. So I find these allusions to the Old Testament interesting. That
Not just Jesus did it, but
yeah. I'm not very knowledgeable about the Old Testament, so when I read about these things, I think, oh, that's it. I didn't know that. That's interesting. And we were talking about, there's some odd little phrases. I mean, since Mark is so spare with his words, usually when he puts stuff in there, it seems like there must be a point. And this seems an odd intrusion, talking about the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod, but Myers thinks he put it in there for a reason, and that's to identify the two main political forces hostile to Jesus' kingdom project of reconciling the Jews and Gentiles. Myers, is, of course, in this book, takes a political interpretation several times. So, what do you think? Of course, the Pharisees they want to keep things pure and clean and separate, which is directly opposite to what we're talking about. Jesus going back and forth to connect the Jews and Gentiles, and both are included in his fellowship. The Herodians, they want to cooperate so that they can maintain their positions of power. And if you don't cooperate, then you might meet the end like John the Baptist. Well, either one is not heading or fulfilling what Jesus is trying to achieve with the one loaf community. That's my little interpretation of the one loaf.
Yeah. I guess I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, where is the power in our, that time, even our time? It's in the people. And if the people are separated, they're not powerful. But if they came together and shared, like the loaves and the fishes story, that they were generous to each other, they were caring for each other, and everybody had something enough to and more to share. So is Jesus trying to tell them, if you guys would just stop being separate and work together, you would be more powerful than the Romans. You would be more powerful
than anything. So my whole thinking is that's what he's trying to show them. And it's hitting them in the forehead and falling off. I mean, they're just not getting it.
But they might be intimidated.
Of course they
What
are.
did we say? There was four Roman.
Here we are.
I'm trying to think what the was. The military.
Legions.
Legions. Yeah, thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah.
4 legions kind of nearby.
Yeah. But again, if you're talking lots and lots of people, you can sometimes overwhelm that.
They might have some more leverage.
Yeah, but the Pharisees and the Herodians want, because in order to maintain power, they sort of like today, we've got, if you divide us and politicize everything, then we will not be united.
It's not like what you and Nadine saying, united we stand, divided we fall.
Right.
Back to the numbers, the numerology I was trying to get to. 5, 12, and 7. And then he asked, I asked him how many loaves do you have that one time? Well, 5. And how many baskets did you get left over? 12. Another time is when you had 7 loaves to start with, you had 7 baskets left over. So Myers again thinks this is clues that they don't get, and the 5 loaves represent the 5 books of Moses, and the 12 baskets of leftovers are the 12 tribes. And the 7 is kind of a number of completion that in the ancient world. I guess we still think it's lucky 7s, So. And then he used a word, and Myers also has said that when he was referred to the Jewish feeding, he used a Jewish word for the basket called kokinos, and then spiros for when he was feeding the Gentiles or the Greeks. So he used different words referred to a basket. So Myers thinks this leads to pointing out it's Jews and Gentiles trying to seek reconciliation here between them. And these are two groups of people that are not on the best of terms.
I just want to throw in that there's 2 other stories in the Old Testament besides Moses and manna where people were fed miraculously. One was with the prophet Elijah. He made the unending supply of flour and oil for the widow.
Right.
And then Elisha fed 100 men, folded maybe or something like that, for whom there was not enough food. So, Jesus feeding the 5,000 and 4,000 kind of elevates him to even greater status than prophets, which I think is, maybe has something like this.
Well, the Jews would know that because that's their scriptures.
Yeah.
So Mark is elevated by feeding a lot more people than either Elijah or Elisha but Moses, he doesn't beat that one though.
Yeah, that's over 2 million people. That's pretty good.
So maybe we have to kind of
Moses
was Moses.
Who knows how many?
Well, I think, probably Jesus would have thought back then and this time that Moses was the greatest of all of the Jewish prophets. Maybe that doesn't bother some to think that he fed more people for longer than anybody had. Actually, God did it.
So Myers sees a lot of symbolism in what Mark has written. So what do you think of this one, that the sea voyages back and across? Sometimes I think one time it's uneventful, but several times they have some, it's stormy or whatever. He thinks this symbolizes the difficulty of reconciliation. Is that too much of a stretch, or is he reading Mark right, that there's some symbolism in the difficulty of the sea voyages back and forth?
I can say everywhere Jesus traveled, that wasn't a symbol. Somewhere he did. I think the trip itself is
Well,
That's just me. I think all the gets a little confused. I know they're not mad, but they don't necessarily assign them there.
But they kind of were back then.
Yeah, they had
Yeah, I think Mark was assigning it. Mark was
But
assigning
You know, we have that numerology and fairy tales.
it.
I mean, you think about, I mean, back then, that's, you know, the way they did it. All the
think he
trees
was-
and the fairy tales you've ever heard.
Yeah, he was selective. I mean, he also fed 4,000. Why didn't he put the number 4 in there? It's 5, 7, and 12. What happened to 4?
Couldn't find the other time.
Why did he choose 12 apostles? Or 12 disciples, I should say 12 disciples. They're later called apostles. So, was there some, I always thought there was some political significance there because the 12 tribes.
Well, I think they do, it connects to the 12 tribes.
So
I'm not sure that's magical.
there's symbology there.
Connection.
Yeah.
Well, I think he wanted to reach out to all the 12 tribes.
Okay,
The fact that he used 2 different words for the term basket means he was very deliberate with his language.
Mark was.
Yeah, Mark was. So that to me means he's deliberate
Was he
whenever he's.
bilingual?
Huh?
Was he bilingual?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure he can. You know, but he knew the words of the different people. You know, I mean, it'd be like the British call a truck a lorry. So that's not bilingual. That's just this is this culture's version of a truck. You know, so I'm up to this culture.
Well, some had theories that Jesus worked in the Greek area as a technician or carpenter or whatever. And so he would have been exposed to the language.
Well, Mark for sure. I mean, I don't know if Jesus did or not, but Mark for sure was being deliberate. That's my only point.
Yeah. Okay, so the Gentiles and Jews didn't get along, and Myers says this was manifested at every level of politics and in the culture. Then he throws in, this came out of another book, not in ours, we're studying here. He wrote another book. It's part of the tragedy of modern theology that the social dimensions of the primitive Christian struggle to reconcile Jew and Gentile has been thoroughly suppressed, despite Paul's writings in which that was central. That's kind of a hard read. So he says modern theology, they focused on other stuff besides Paul's trying to reconcile Jews and Gentiles. So what did they focus? What we modern theologians focused on about Paul? For me, it would be the way, at least Protestants, justification by faith. I would say that. Is our focus, is that focus of theologians changing? Well, we studied that book, The New Perspective of Paul, and that kind of came out that Paul was interested in how to integrate the Gentiles into the following, the faith of the Christians, the Jewish Christians, and to kind of get them integrated as part of that group and had battles over it. Okay, we're right through this. We've talked about Constantine before, how when the Christianity became the official religion of the empire, that focus shifted from those at the bottom to those at the top who were in power. And when the Christians became in power, and then those who had no power to those in power. And today, the church is not as dominant as it was just even 50 years ago. Miss Lauren Mead, he wrote a book, Once a Huge Church. I haven't read it, but it was mentioned in Meyer's book that sees this decline of the church dominance as an opportunity to reclaim what was obvious to the first Christians. What do you think? Is this an opportunity for the church to exist on the margins for the refugee, the abused woman, unemployed, homeless, to be the voice crying in the wilderness? this an opportunity?
I say yes.
Sounds like a rationalization.
Rationalization for a decline?
For being on the margins.
Okay, explain yourself there. I'm not following.
Well,
Are we on the margin? Are we not on?
well, we're becoming so.
Well, you're looking at margins from a power standpoint. He's talking about people that are in the margin. I think you're reading that a little differently.
Yes, I don't understand the question. You mean this is an opportunity to regrow the Christian church by focusing on something
Yes.
before?
That's what I think. That's what Mead's saying. Is this is an opportunity to change our focus to be on those who are marginalized.
Yeah. I'd have to say maybe on that, because there's also a lot of good secular organizations who do good work, Doctors Without Borders, and what's that?
Heart to heart.
What's that? Heart to Heart?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know that people necessarily gravitate. You know, maybe they do because they were brought up Christian and they go back and reclaim some of that. But I think there are just good people in the world too that want to do some good things and help others, and realize that, you know, if we don't help the others, then it's a problem that's just going to get worse and worse.
I think part of the expansion of the Christian mission is to recognize those others.
Yeah.
You know, and to become a part of those other groups. You know, that it isn't just, oh, I'm Christian, therefore I'm the one that has the truth that I'm going to take to them. You know, I mean, I met an atheist yesterday who used the exact words that we are using in class. He said, this is a white middle class man, and he said, I have just been recognizing recently about the privilege that I have, and I recognize that there are people, he didn't use the word marginalized, but he did use the word privilege, and I'm thinking, this is a broader theme in our world right now. We absolutely need to expand.
Probably for 18 or 1900 years, the church was the focus of those kinds of movements. All hospitals were churches.
That's true. That's true.
I mean, that's where healthcare basically came from.
Yeah.
And our church
But
really tries to emphasize
you know,
it.
the world has expanded outside that, and I'm not sure as a recruitment tool that people would necessarily start coming back to church. I think lots of people are interested in helping and want to volunteer in a soup kitchen or go on a service trip to some country. And
Okay, I read this differently than you're reading that differently, I think, than the way I'm reading. Because he's not saying the church should be dominant again, it should serve.
Yeah.
And that's the point, isn't really that you serve to increase your numbers and become dominant again. That's not the way I read it. But that sounds like you're kind of reading.
no, I thought maybe that's what you thought he was saying. Was that this is real Christian.
Well, if you're,
Well, that is that
That's
first
always-
sentence.
Now, the first sentence up there about Constantine, I think, is saying that the focus got inverted.
yes,
And
I
so
agree with
that
that.
when we inverted it, then we focused on power instead of serving.
Well,
Although there was always a group that served.
I've never
What
not
you're
been
saying.
serving
Um,
in the church.
No, I can see the point of trying to move church communities back toward this focus,
Yeah.
away from sort of a centrist
Yeah.
approach to doing religion. And I'm the pastor, I'm the
And I think a lot
financial
of
officer, so I'm important. It's what are we doing out there in the community? And I'm not picking on pastors.
But isn't there a focus now? Some people are saying the church has lost its dominance, and they think we're losing something by not being dominant in society the way we were, and they are trying to reclaim that.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this question: did our early Restoration Church exist on the margins? I'm talking about the 1830s and 1840s, and what was happening in the church? They were working on these Zionic communities, and who was attracted to that? Came into there, kind of had a lot of poor people from England came. I just kind of wondered, were they really existing on the margins back then in Joseph Smith's time? And do we exist on the margins? That's kind of I think that'd be scary for us, really, for most of us. when you're out there living in the midst of the poor people, most of us live in pretty nice places. Anyway,
Well, you think of all the churches that have evolved out of the early movement in the 1830s, the Mormon Church is by far most dominant and by far the wealthiest.
they are.
And politically influential in the state of Utah, and probably other places in the state of Idaho.
So you're saying they don't exist on the margin?
But I'm not going to judge because I don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
It seems like the mission of the powerful Christians, I should say, and a lot of Christian people think the mission is to proselytize and to grow the church and make the world Christian. Or I don't think that's living on the margin. I don't think that was Jesus. I don't think that's what Jesus was saying. Jesus was saying, feed the hungry, go out and be the servant, like what Nathan said. Not go and make them believe in me. Just be Christ-like. I think Christians forget that lesson today.
There's been so much damage in our world done in the name of Christian, church.
Did anybody watch 1922?
Yeah, tell us about it.
Well, part of it, this is a prequel to Yellowstone. A sequel to 1803. One of the characters is an Indian girl. Like a Catholic school for badly abused and stuff. And force her to become a Christian. Force her to become socialized like European American.
That sounds like the boarding school
Yes,
exhibit at Johnson County
that's
Museum.
just like an old.
Well, and it happened everywhere. I mean,
The missions in California.
Mission, Kansas.
right up the road here.
I know. I remember going to that museum as a kid and completely missing the point of what the mission can is. Because they don't.
Well, they just talked about it being in school.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't explain how the school worked.
Forced them.
Well, the same thing happened. Well, I don't know if they have special boarding schools, but in Hawaii, they tried to suppress their language
They did.
and their
Absolutely.
yeah.
Paul
In
has
the
a
60s.
Yeah.
Paul has a cousin who has actually gone to school to bring it back. But they did. They suppressed everything.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what Christianity was for so long. That's why there's so many people who resist it. Because it's not happy, come to Jesus, love, love, love. It's beat you over the head with the Bible. I mean, it was horrible. I mean,
Convert or die.
yes.
Essentially, yes.
Yes.
It was sort of like
Well, it's
continuing
what was the French where they were burning people? Stake? I mean,
yeah, I
I'm
was
kind of
going
embarrassed when
oh yeah.
I think through history.
Like we continued the Crusades into modern time.
Karen, I heard you say something.
Don't you think all parochial schools, Catholic schools, schools, kind of beat the religion into the students?
Sometimes literally.
Not,
But
really, that,
no,
currently,
just, you
that
go to
depends.
mass every morning. This is required.
That's the parents deciding to take them there, though.
But I work with parochial kids, and they are not thumping you over the head with their religion. I mean, and in the cases I work with, they have to come to me in a public school, and they're outnumbered by public school kids, and they fit right in. They're not throwing any, religion. They might appreciate their religion, but I don't think it's the same as it used to be in a lot of those schools.
It almost creates. I know a lot of people who grew up in Catholic schools. It almost has the opposite effect on these kids. It's like, yes, I have to go to mass every morning. I have a I had a nun who slapped me on the hand or made
They're
me.
not nuns or anything teaching anymore.
Made me,
Regular
yeah,
teachers.
I know this was back in the
Yeah.
day when
Oh,
our
yeah.
when our generation was young. I mean, I see the product of those schools, and I don't think they did such a great job. That's what they were trying to do.
The book Angela's Ashes, he talks a lot about his upbringing in
Yes.
Catholic schools,
Yes,
and
I
he,
remember.
what he remembered the most was they had to practice learning how to take communion for their first communion to go through that
Yeah,
ritual.
yeah.
And the nuns would tear up newspapers and feed them, say, "This is your communion host, this is your wafer, eat this," and they'd practice eating the newspapers. If they didn't do it right, they'd get beaten or hit with a ruler or something like that.
There's a proper way to eat your wafer.
Yeah,
Apparently.
you're not supposed to drop it or anything like that.
Well, I got a little bit more to go.
Okay.
So from the people who live on the margins, they have a different perspective than we have.
Definitely.
Sure.
If there were several people here in our Sunday school class that actually live on the margins, maybe they're homeless, Bernice, would they challenge us? Could they challenge us the way we read the scriptures? They might read it differently, you think?
Yes, I think they should challenge it. We should be open to new ways of thinking about it.
You always have one perspective, you see it one way.
No, I always remember during the Depression, I'd hear stories. I hear stories. Old people come back now. But they would, they didn't have a lot of food, and somebody would come and knock on their door, and they would give them some of their food.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something about, the generosity of people on the margin. It goes way beyond people who are privileged.
Yeah.
Where it's like, I got to keep all this. Somebody might take it. Whereas people aren't. They're just like providing handouts because they know somebody's going to take it. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's been.
Potluck came from. I didn't talk about that a few weeks ago.
I know there's been studies that show that poor people are more generous than rich people.
Yeah.
Absolutely. How the rich stay rich.
Now, I mean, they're looking at it from a percentage basis, not total dollars.
Right.
Anyway,
You have a widow and her two mites.
yeah. So this is the last little part of before the next section starts, our discipleship journey. And we talked about borders, crossing borders, Jesus crossing boundaries back and forth. So we use borders sometimes helpfully to define who we are and know who we are, but sometimes we don't use it so helpfully. Separate ourselves from others who are the only thing they're guilty of is that are different from us, maybe. And wealth, class, and gender are primary ones that are used. And then back to Galatians, what Paul said, there's no such thing as Jew and Greek, slave and freeman, male and female, for you all one person in Christ Jesus. So, have we followed his injunction?
Not very well, although I think it's changing. Yeah.
I don't know. Some of us are getting better.
So then,
Russia and Ukraine are both Christian countries, both out of the Orthodox tradition, and yet they can't practice this. They see themselves as different. Go to war over it.
I mean, that wealth, class, gender, we were talking yesterday again about just this tribalism. We let tribalism get in the way of the message. That's the problem. I mean, what class of people am I a part of? What group do I feel comfortable with? Instead of, humankind, or something that we can all join together on for our tribe, which is very natural, but it's also something to be aware of as the privileged class, that there's others who aren't fitting.
well, I'm as guilty as anybody else. Like to be comfortable.
Yeah.
So, if you get uncomfortable, then
There's been times we've had trouble even in this church doing that, because you think about when a few number of years ago when 3 different congregations combined to form the Highlands. There were people from those groups that couldn't do that. They couldn't come together with people that had gone to other branches, and so they dropped out.
I've heard that, but I've never
And,
understood
that
it.
was an excuse we heard some years ago when we were looking at maybe talking to Lenax or
What year,
some other
what year did
congregations.
Joan try to put this all together?
Nobody wants to give up their tribal congregation.
Better building.
Yeah.
We need to look at Earthrise from the moon that was taken in 1967 or 8 when they came around. There's that,
69.
well, it wasn't when they landed, it was before. It was the first time they orbited. And they said that picture they thought was going to change perspective of humans because they can see, you're all in that little ball in the middle of this vast universe. Maybe you start working together a little better, but it's gone, that's too long ago, I think. We should all have a refrigerator or something.
That's all I have. Does anybody have anything that they thought in this chapter that I overlooked that you want?
I think as we've gone through this book, the emphasis of the authors on social justice, many times I find myself thinking, this is the world that I wish for. I'm not sure that I'm at the point, I should be at the point where the world I'm ready to build. And I think as humans, we probably all think a lot like that. This is the world we'd like to see, but are we really ready to start working for it? Yeah,
Once again, you gotta get out of our comfort zone.
Well, I know this Ched
Put your
Myers.
money where your mouth is.
Yeah. Ted Myers written that he and a group of other, I guess you'd say like-minded Christians, they actually moved to live in a poor neighborhood as a group. That's what they did. They thought that was what they were called to do. But it's not in this book. But they actually, as a group, later they disbanded. They had some internal frictions, and it didn't last forever, but it lasted for a few years. But that's where they went. And they, ministered in that local community. What they call
They did try to put their money where their mouth was.
I have some Nazarene friends that moved to 14th and Metropolitan and operated as a commune. So you own the lawnmower. When I needed to mow my yard, came and got the lawnmower. When you own the washing machine, when I needed to do laundry, I came and did laundry. And they kind of opened that up to that community. Created a grocery store there. I mean, and it worked.
Still going?
It worked. Oh, Franklin Center.
It takes a lot to put yourself in that situation. I would think, does anybody know Ed Guy? I know he passed away, but his story, maybe El Salvador or something, and all of the dangers that he faced because he was willing to go down and advocate for the people who were before and now.
Well, he actually did what they were talking about.
Yeah.
The church
He did.
in the margins.
Yeah.
Didn't Ed slaughter and his wife? And it's kind of inner city for that very reason too.
I don't know. I've heard that.
I'm glad there's that one. Somebody developing them.
But thanks for everybody's participation today.